is organised by SEDA Land, part of the Scottish Ecological Design Association. It's the first in a series of events about value change in rural Scotland to help reverse the declining population. The aim of the conversation is to look at what the Scottish Government can do to encourage a better functioning local food chain, specifically about bringing value back to this area. And in this case, we are in Huntly in Aberdeenshire. How do we get more local, nutritional and seasonal foods into the food chain to support resilient communities and for health equity? So our key findings are going to be fed back to the Scottish Government. As everybody knows, there's a lot of consultation going on. This work will be informing its Just Transition Plan for land use and agriculture, the Scottish National Adaptation Plan, as well as wider climate policy. And I think we all also know about our first National Good Food Nation Plan, which is also out for consultation at the moment. So great to feed our findings back from today into that. So I'm Kirsty Tate. I'm the Director for Scotland for the Food, Farming and Countryside Commission. And this is my co-chair, Lorna Dawson, beside me. So we're an independent charity that was set up in 2017 to help shape the future of food and farming, land use and the countryside. So our purpose, like SEDA, is to bring people together from all different perspectives to find practical and radical solutions which tackle the climate, nature, health and economic crises of our time. So we're really delighted to be working in partnership with this event. We have a major new initiative called the Food Conversation, which we're involving citizens from across the UK in big questions about food. And our findings so far have found that citizens from all backgrounds and political leanings want businesses and government to take action on food. And they expect government to take the hard decisions needed to protect people and the planet. So I'm really delighted that the Scottish Government is funding this work. So the format's going to be a bit different from most SEDA Land events, and we hope it's going to be enjoyable for us all here, as well as the online audience. So it's going to be divided into two parts with a 5-minute comfort break in the middle. I've got a series of people in the audience that are going to provide short provocations, and also, we'll open it out and we'll run it just quite organically. And I also want to invite the remote audience to please put up your question and answers in the question and answer function. And these will be picked up by our house team and fed into the roundtable discussion. Please also introduce yourself in the chat. I think it's really great to see where people are joining us from this afternoon. So I'm going to ask the group to introduce themselves when they speak first as the discussion progresses. We're really delighted, and we've had a bit of a show already in the farm tour from artists who feel passionately about the environment and food. So SEDA has commissioned new pieces for this event. We have Dawn Finch and Sarah McFadden, who have collaborated on the pieces being premiered here this afternoon. So really looking forward to that. So with much further ado, I'm going to invite Sarah McFadden up, who is a traditional fiddler and member of the Poots, and whose songs I think you'll be familiar with if you've joined some of the SEDA Land events before. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah.
Hello, nice to be here on Lock Farm. Yeah, Gail asked me to write a few light-hearted songs about soil, so this is what came out. It's a bit full up now. I'll give it a go. I was waiting on my school lunch, standing in the queue, when I saw what was on the menu. Mud pie dinner, mud pie dinner. I said, what's this new? Some duck cheap stew, do you really expect me to give that a chew? Mud pie dinner, mud pie dinner. Hey dinner lady, what's this you're serving me? Hey dinner lady, what's this you're serving me? Well, it's anything but dirt cheap. This is the finest spade of earth. This dish is a rich mud cake, 'cause small, the most flavoursome universe.
I walked back to the table with my fork and knife, holding onto them for dear life. And my mud pie dinner, my mud pie dinner. The other bands were staring at their mud pie stew, and we all wondered what it was that we should do with our mud pie dinner, our mud pie dinner. Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? So I took my knife and fork and I had a dig about. Then a worm said hello as he popped his head out of my mud pie dinner, my mud pie dinner. I said, ootsie-noo, what a yucky goo, how can I eat you? I think I'm gonna spew in my mud pie dinner, my mud pie dinner. Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? The dinner lady came over, said she thought it was wise that us kids all get acquainted with the guys inside our pies. Our mud pie dinners, our mud pie dinners. I'm sure you'd like nothing better than sausage, beans and fries, but to get that you need to learn to keep the soil alive. Our mud pie dinner, mud pie dinner. Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Well, it's anything but dirt cheap. This dirt, this is the finest spade of earth. This dish is a rich mud cake, cosmos, a most flavoursome universe. Mr. Worm showed us about of his mud pie house, around microbial confetti and the fungi spaghetti. Mud pie dinner, mud pie dinner. We like to eat the dead things, old leaves and rotting sticks. Dead animals are juicy, we meet them in the mix of our mud pie dinners, our mud pie dinners. Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? So, do you get it yet? We are what your food eats, the number one ingredient in all your recipes. For your mud pie dinners, your mud pie dinners. And then when you die, you'll go into the sky, but down into this earth you'll remain. 'Cause you're a mud pie dinner, a mud pie dinner. Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Hey, dinner lady, what's this you serving me? Well, it's anything but dirt cheap. This dirt, this is the finest spade of air. This dish is a rich mud cake, cosmos, a most flavoursome universe. Well, it's anything but dirt cheap. This dirt, this is the finest spade of air. This dish is a rich mud cake, cosmos, a most flavoursome universe.
Thank you, Sarah. That was fantastic. I'm just going to use this opportunity to give a big shout out to all the dinner staff and teachers who are working across Scotland, building food and outdoor education into the curriculum and working quite against hard conditions. So big shout out to you guys. I know my kids still love worms and getting their hands dirty and have school dinners every day. So I think, yeah, big shout out. Fantastic song. Really makes us think about the soil and bringing the soil to life and actually getting people to understand what's actually in soil. And moving on from that, we've got a couple of short provocations that we're going to begin with, looking at food nutrition and diversity to kickstart discussion today. So yeah, remote audience, just post up your questions through the chat and they'll be fed into discussion. And after the provocations, please, everyone, if you've got a question, just indicate. I'm not a livestock auctioneer, so no just raised eyebrows and fingers. Hands right up. Okay, so I'm going to hand over to Lorna Dawson, and she is going to give the first provocation, which is diversity is key to resilience, starting with healthy soil.
Thank you very much, Kirsty. And thank you, Sarah. That was wonderful. We really felt that we were in that soil and we were, in a strange sort of way, we were actually eating it. And we do, because in a way we really do eat our soil, because as we can see from the pull up there, that the soil is full of all sorts of wonderful things. The nutrients, the nitrogen, phosphorus, potassium, those nutrients that we need in large amounts, calcium, magnesium, sulfur required, chlorine, magnesium, nickel, iron, copper, zinc. We're going to talk about zinc right through here. These are micronutrients that are required in relatively smaller amounts, but they're still required for us and for the plants that grow on the soil. But as well as that, we've got the living part of the soil. We've got the bacteria, the tiny, tiny little organisms. Did you know that there's more organisms in a teaspoonful of soil than there are people living on this planet? Wow, that is just amazing, isn't it? The fungi, so you also get nematodes that come along and eat the bacteria. You get nematodes that eat the fungi, and then you get parasitic nematodes. So they're the good, but then you get the bad, and then you get the really ugly in the soil. They're the root parasitic nematodes. So, but then what comes along are the birds that we saw today when we were out in the farm tour with Roger, and the worms, all these things that are also good for the soil, to aerate it. The soil looks after our water, our air, and the food, ultimately the food that we eat. And onto the food that we eat, the plants that grow in that soil, they live on the water and the sunshine that converts these nutrients, these elements in the soil, into plant material that we eat and digest. So some of these elements are in those plants that grow, and we'll take their zinc, for example. Zinc is essential for seed formation and photosynthesis in plants. And iron, for example, it's an oxygen carrier and it promotes the plant growth. But once you get these plants, ultimately, then we harvest them, the farmers harvest them, and we are lucky enough that we can eat them. And they reflect the diversity of that range of organisms and the range of those elements that are in the soil. And for example, here's zinc within humans, and we'll hand on to Wendy because she's the one that knows about human nutrition. But the zinc, for example, affects our taste, our reproductive system, component of all our enzymes, iron, our brain, our muscle function, acid-base balance, and it delivers oxygen to our tissues. But back to the here and now, it's so important. So we are what we eat. We are the soil that we live on and the food that we eat from that. But it's the physical, chemical and biological health of our soil that's important. And we can see from today, walking around with Roger on his wonderful farm, it's loved, it's cared for, it's nurtured like all human beings should be. This farm is a living ecosystem. And farm size type is important. The diversity of the farms that we see here, this diversity of soil types that he's got, the diversity of crops, the introduction of new novel crops, that's all enriching that land that we've had the privilege of walking around today. It builds up the organic matter. We've got high organic matter here for the soil type, good pH values, the variety of drainage systems, the mixed rotations, valuable and special, delivering provenance. What we see here is true quality provenance. And the biogeodiversity, it's an undervalued resource, and it's an ability to enhance and improve our human health. So we need this biodiversity for our human resilience, for our life and existence on this very planet. And it's down to people like Roger, farmers who love and care for their land, which ultimately love and care for the people on this planet. Thank you. So soil, we wouldn't have life if we didn't have soil.
Thank you, Lorna. So I think I'm going to hand over straight to Wendy and go into nutrition, and then we'll take a break and we'll have a bit of a roundtable discussion.
Okay, I'm just going to say a few words. I mean, Lorna's made soil sound magnificent and really diverse, but to be honest, there is a problem with our food system. I don't have to tell people in this room that most of us are dying of non-communicable diseases, so these are food related. Oh, sorry. So these are food related. If you look at the statistics, almost about 70% of people are dying of diet related diseases. So we really need to do something about our food system. And I don't think it's fair that we ask consumers to make those choices. It's a very difficult food system we're living in, and making the correct choices isn't easy. So I think we need to change that system, change the environment that people in. I thought Peter Chi was going to be here from Nourish Scotland because he's got some nice initiatives like public diners where he's going to try and encourage people to try new foods. But I think we need to think more strategically about how we do that. And there's a few things I think we can do. First of all, I think we need to look at the current crops we grow in Scotland. Our major crop's barley. And yet 60% goes to animal feed and the rest almost goes to distilling and brewing. Very little goes into the food supply chain. And barley's a really nutritious, really valuable food. And I think instead of focusing on yield, which is what we've done when we've been developing barley lines, we need to think more about climate resilience and what the ranges of barley will do for our soil. The second thing I think we can do is introduce novel crops. And it was really nice to see that Roger's got his buckwheat. We're really keen on buckwheat. We know its strong nutritional value. We're also keen on crops like hemp. Hemp is an amazing crop for the environment. It sequesters more CO2 than trees. It's got a deep taproot that brings the micronutrients to the fore. When you grow a crop in succession, you improve the yields. So a crop like hemp can really benefit our food system. But we need to get these foods into the diet, into our diet. So we need to work with people that want to put them into the foods we're eating. But the final thing I really want to speak about is what we do with our lands in Scotland, how we manage our lands. If you look at the map of Scotland, we're almost all marginal land. Why don't we use those marginal lands much more effectively? It's great to see initiatives to reforest Scotland and to regenerate our peat bogs, but can we bring some of that into the food system? I've worked a long time on wild relatives of a lot of our modern crops, and we know that we've bred our crops for productivity and profit, but we've bred a lot of nutrition out of the foods we eat. Some of the wild relatives are much more nutritious, and some of the wild foods that we could grow in forest areas are very nutritious. And they might not be a substantial part of our food system, but they could contribute quite a lot to nutrition and to biodiversity in our diet. I'd just like to finish by saying that as humans, we really need a diverse diet. Our gut microbiome relies on it. And right at this moment, we're eating about 5 different animals and 12 plants as our major component of our diet. We need to increase that diversity. And I think Scotland's the ideal place to do that. And I think that's all I've got to say. So thank you.
Thank you, Wendy. And just to say, you're running a webinar tomorrow night, aren't you, on novel crops? Yes, and that's you can Eventbrite, and it's you'll see it if you put in novel crops, and you'll be able to learn a bit more in detail about that. It's fascinating. So I'm going to open it up to the room for questions. If anybody would like to ask Wendy or Lorna any questions about diversity, resilience, nutrition, and yep, well, we have these amazing experts in the room. And even just maybe perspectives of what's going on in this area as well in terms of crops. Do we have anyone that?
Do you have any livestock people here? Because I think it's important that the livestock in the system is also considered.
No.
I was just sorry.
Hi there, I'm Dawn Finch. I'm really interested that you said, was it five animals and
12 plants, essentially.
and 12 and only 12 plants. So that's essentially, though it's almost a monoculture. So what are the 12 plants? I'm interested. I know it's a bit of a, but what are the sort of the top ones?
So the top are obviously wheat. So the top plants are obviously things like, right, we're talking globally. So the top plants are really things like wheat and rice and sorghum. And barley is the 4th biggest crop in the world. You wouldn't know that it's the 4th largest crop in the world. And yet in Scotland, we eat less than 3% of barley. And yet it's our major crop that we produce. So we're very limited if you actually break down and look at the plants and animals that we eat. We do have a very limited diet.
That's quite
Although it
astonishing.
doesn't look that way in the supermarket. You go into the supermarket and it looks like there's a diverse array of food out there. But if you actually look at what they're comprised of, you'll find it's wheat and soya and rice and very few other things that are there.
And you briefly mentioned buckwheat. So what's the deal with buckwheat then that makes
So-
it special?
So we've worked on buckwheat is a high protein crop. It's got quite a lot of protein in it. It's got a lot of fiber and a lot of micronutrients. But our interest really comes from the fact that we studied it and we saw that it reduced blood glucose.
Oh,
So we
wow.
developed a formulation where we can actually, for people with type 2 diabetes, controlling it with diet or with medication, can use this buckwheat extra to reduce their blood glucose. So buckwheat in your diet regularly would help with glucose metabolism.
So there's people spending a fortune on so-called superfoods when buckwheat is pennies.
Well, there's a whole lot of food
Yeah.
that we could be eating that are much better for us.
That's
Yeah.
amazing. Thank you.
I think you were. Yeah. So I'm Andy. I run a large farmers co-op. The one thing I think we need to consider in this, if we're serious about solving society's nutritional problems, we need to be realistic about scale. So we sell 500,000 pigs a year, and that provides enough protein to feed the Scottish population for only 1 month. Now, I would love them all to eat pork all the time, but clearly they eat other kinds of protein. But we need kind of regional scale initiatives and thinking rather. I commend everyone who's trying to do things, at individual farm level, but to make a bigger dent in the societal problems, we need to think collaboratively on local and regional scale. So that's really my big ask for the thing, is just we need to think bigger.
Thank you. So around the room, I mean, I guess we're in this. Oh, sorry, Johnny, do you want to? Is it?
Yep. Yes, we'll come in.
I'm Johnny Balfour from Pasture for Life. I did stand up. I was just looking at the handout we have, and much the things that we see about what is a sustainable diet has beef at the very top of a bad part of the diet, and particularly in here we've got beef along with sweets as being the worst offenders in terms of diet. How does that fit with the need in our diets for things like zinc, iron, and vitamin B12?
I can maybe comment on that. So I think meat is a premium product in terms of amino acids. It is a very healthy source of protein, and I think it's all very well to have a small amount of meat in our diet. I think the problem comes in when red meat becomes a major component of your diet at the expense of other things you can be eating. So I think when you're looking at these food triangles in terms of health or in terms of climate, red meat is up there, on both of those counts. But I think, it's in Scotland, we have some of the best red meat in the world with, Aberdeen Angus and Highland. We would hate to see those industries go completely, but without a doubt, too much red meat in the diet is unhealthy, and too much red meat does contribute to some of our climate problems. So we have to address these things and find a balance. And, I think the question about scale is really important, because we have to feed our livestock too. So we have to think carefully about what we're feeding them. And I know what you're talking. I mean, I'm working with Duncan Farms at the moment, and we're trying to replace soya in the chicken diet. One shed of chickens, 19,000 chickens, eat 3 tons of hemp a month, when we're replacing soya. So you're talking about having to produce these crops on scale in Scotland if you're going to feed the livestock and get rid of things like soya. So I really take what you're talking about scale, but I think some of these things are possible. And one of the things we did, we even looked at it growing wild in Scotland is gorse. We extracted protein from gorse, and I know it's not human food at the moment, but we extracted protein to 90% purity, and we looked at how much gorse is burnt back or treated with herbivores in Scotland, and there's enough to feed the population in terms of protein. So if you think differently, there are ways that we can get around some of these issues around scale.
And also, if I can just add that, what better converter of our green stuff that we have out there in the grass to turn that to good quality meat, a use of the good Scottish landscape for that production of good meat, absolutely is the right thing to do. And it's an absolute essential part of our diet to have the components that are in meat. But Wendy's right, it should be reduced. In general, people eat too much red meat for their health when they're having meat every day. But it's more the processed part of that meat rather than the pure meat per se. And also it's the meat within the farming system. So the livestock that graze, they return the organic matter to the soil, so that a lot of the farms that have that whole agricultural system basis to it, the soils have actually got higher organic matter content because it's been returned through manures over the years, in fact, centuries, in fact, in some places. So it's diversity, and it's a little of everything is good, but not too much of one thing. Sorry.
Yes, I'll hand over.
Thank you, David Mackay from Soil Association. Do I stand up? Okay. Just to pick up on Andy's point about scale, which I think is a good one, something that we often come back to when we're thinking about Scottish Government priorities around a good food nation and local food strategies and short supply chains, all things I'm sure everybody in this room would agree we would like to see. One of the biggest challenges around regional and local processing infrastructure. So that applies both in terms of livestock, so particularly thinking about sectors where we don't have the scale. So right now there's a massive problem with organic producers, for example, in terms of access to abattoirs. And we have organic beef finishers in the northeast of Scotland forced to travel to Newcastle to get their animals slaughtered. And of course, you don't want to do that for a number of reasons, not least animal welfare. But beyond meat, there's also, when we talk about novel crops, so we went to a farm, Balmacuen in Aberdeenshire recently, because they have organic peas. They want to get into the local council procurement. Those peas have to go all the way down to England to be processed in order to come back up to be in a form that can be acceptable to the local council. So we really do need to think about that, having that local processing infrastructure, and also thinking about who's going to pay for it. So I think that is there a role, and I know that the Scottish Government is listening or is going to be tuning into this. So thinking about what the role of government is within that, what the role might be for producer co-ops, more cooperative models, perhaps we could think about that. There's good examples in other countries around Europe, I think. So yeah, just one for the group to think about.
Thank you. David Miller, James Hutton Institute. Just a couple of observations, one of which is going to sound contradictory, I suspect, and that's how we look at the balance between nutrition and affordability. Not that there should be a tension between them, but it seems to me that that's often the case. So while there's crises in various aspects of the economy, then deterring people from purchasing by any means to do with taxation or the like would seem to be the wrong direction of travel. And yet, if we were to look at the alcohol policy, we've got minimum pricing for alcohol to deter misuse, or at least deter use, which is perhaps leading to other forms of societal issues. So is there an argument for minimum pricing for some forms of food so as to increase the cost of food, but increase the value going into the food, the value chains, to something that's more realistic across many more products, and design policy so that it delivers on nutrition and solve the affordability problem by other means? We are, if I understand correctly, not doing 2-4s, or there is policy against 2-4. Should that policy extend a bit more towards some of the more processed end of the food market and help balance up affordability by another means with nutrition? I'll stop.
Thank you, David. And that is certainly at FSCC a very live discussion that we're having, and we're supporting the citizen dialogue to have. I think the findings are that people are open to that kind of thing. And I think we do see, I mean, there's a debate, there was a debate last week in Westminster on ultra processed foods, and I think it is a very live discussion. I think there is levers, isn't there? And I think as we see the effects of that on our children, I mean, certainly I've got an 8-year-old and a 12-year-old, and I do see the effects of that kind of food on our kids right now. I think it is a discussion to be had. And I think, you know, we're right at the middle of co-designing our National Good Food Nation plan. This is a time for everyone to have a say, to actually say what is a good food nation? What does it look like? What does it look like in Scotland? What is good food in Scotland? I mean, I don't think we're even at that stage of really understanding what Scottish good food is. So fantastic. And I think I know I'm maybe going back to David's point, Soil Association, about cooperatives and the local, and how do you get that kind of local regional energy happening, and how to make those food systems work. And I'd like to invite Bob Ewell from SEOS to maybe talk a little bit about.
Oh, goodness me.
Soft fruit and vegetable industry.
Yeah, I'm gonna take you a little back a little few years in my career, just to note that the soft fruit industry in Scotland nearly died, and the green vegetable industry in Scotland nearly died. And we were part of, at that time, of the European Union, and they brought in, and this was happening in other parts of Europe as well. And the question was how do you support them? How do you support that form of industry? And they brought in a system called producer organizations, POs, okay? And the PO system completely and utterly revived raspberries and strawberries and peas and green vegetables and everything in Scotland, completely and utterly. And so how do they do it? What a PO does is several farmers come together and then they hatch a plan. The plan's accepted, and the turnover over succeeding years, probably over 5 years, gives an indication of this level of support that you should get. It's based on a percentage of the turnover, really. And that allows them to grow, to invest. Because the problem you get into here is that unless you have investment, you don't have any movement at all under any circumstances. So the only way you can do that is you have to provide. And it's a very, very inexpensive way of supporting. Now, if I take that a little bit further, behind a lot of what we're discussing is corporate food, right? And it's appalling, really, because it's any which way you can make profit off the cheapest form of ingredients. And anybody who thinks that public procurement of food into prisons and schools are going to solve the problem, you know, we've been doing that for years and years and years, and it's never moved, because their job is to buy food at the cheapest possible price they can, because that's how it works. If you go into Huntly, because we're here in Huntly, Huntly is typical of a small Scottish town, and most small Scottish towns have market squares. But we're not allowed to trade in them. Right? Why? What the hell is that about? It's back to corporations again. So the point I'm going to try and get across this afternoon is that if Scottish government said every single council has to open up every single market square in Scotland to anybody who wants to trade local food with very little impediment, like no impediment, you know, then you start to see things move, because you can't do anything unless you're allowed to trade. And the only people who are allowed to trade in Huntly are Asda and Tesco, who are given special dispensation with respect to their planning permissions and all the rest of it, car parks. So you've got to pay for car parking in the middle of Huntly, but not at Tesco or Asda. It's bonkers. And they pay very little rates, etc., etc. So we've got to be realistic. So you have to allow people who want to grow and develop local foods or local processed foods to be able to go into town and actually sell the bloody stuff. If you can't do that, nothing will happen. Forget it. We just go home. Okay? So that's where we need to be. And we've got the mechanisms to do this. We know how to do it. We just need a little bravery, really, by government and local government to allow people to do what they need to do to make a local food environment grow and develop. Thanks very much. Cheers.
Thank you. That was brilliant, Bob. And I think local authorities, when we have local authorities in the room as well, there is a lot of change happening. I mean, further along the Good Food Nation Act is local good food plans. And each local, is that right? Each local authority and health board will have to produce a Good Food Nation plan. Our National Planning Framework 4 is in. There's a lot of very serious high-level outcomes coming from that. So I think there's a bit of creativity we'll have to go on with local authorities. I know budgets are so tight. I mean, I think that's underneath all of this is these incredibly stretched public finances. But I think there's with a bit of creativity and thinking, and that's a fantastic, yeah.
Need any money to allow people to trade in the market square. You don't need any money. It's just a change to local authority planning or local authority legislation.
Yeah.
It doesn't cost any money. It's bonkers. Just allow us to do what we need to do.
Yeah, fantastic. So yeah, we're capturing all these key findings and key asks. So yeah, that definitely will be one. So has anyone else got questions?
Well, I'll say something. Gail Halverson, SEDA Land. I mean, you mentioned it's no point going through schools and hospitals, but I would certainly say through schools is definitely a way forward. And yesterday, because of this, I spoke to Doug Wunstall from Bank Farm in Kent, and he's managed to get together a group of farmers in that area. They now serve 400 schools in the area and 5 hospitals. He said it took 3 years of him making a loss. He took it on. You said, you know, someone who's going to do it. He led it. It was his initiative and he did it, but he's done it. Now they're making profits. So he said it's tough, but it can be done, but it does need somebody to take a lead. So yeah, as you said, who's going to take that lead?
So this might be a good time to bring in Kim from Aberdeenshire City Council. So I think we need to learn, get an understanding of food procurement and how it works and where might be the opportunities and where, I guess, the barriers as well at the moment. So welcome, Kim.
Hi, I'm Kim Postlethwaite and I'm a senior procurement specialist with the shared procurement, sort of commercial and procurement shared services. I should know who I work for. We work in combination with Aberdeen City, Aberdeenshire and Highland Council, and we help with the public procurement for all 3 councils. Our team is split into different categories, and my manager and I, we are responsible for the food category. So that's why I'm here today. As I'm just saying there, it's quite important to understand the rules and the regulations that are behind the public procurement. It's not as simple as just going down to the school and saying, can I provide your meat for today's lunch? There is a little bit more to it than just that. You'll have to apologise because I'll have to apologise, my notes are on my phone. So the first thing is, what do we do? Which, as I was saying before, you know, we work, thank you. We work with the services within each of the councils to ensure that they are purchasing items compliantly. We do this by helping them establish compliant contracts and advise them of any national agreements that they can potentially utilise. The next thing is, what is public procurement? I know that certainly when I got into public procurement a lifetime ago, I had no idea what it actually meant. So apologies to those who do know what it means. But public procurement refers to the purchase of goods, services and works by public funded organisations such as local councils. Because we are spending public money, there are strict set of rules and regulations that we have to abide by. And these are both set at international, national and local levels. And as I say, they must be followed. All local councils are required to abide by the public procurement rules and regulations. So what are the rules and the regulations? There are various sources for the rules and the regulations that govern public procurement. The main set of regulations for local authorities in Scotland is the Public Contract Scotland Regulations 2015. Now, I'm not going to go through them line by line because it's riveting. Each council then also has its own governance to establish how contracts can be awarded and what procedures must be followed for various spends. This sets out the rules to be followed by each of the councils, taking into consideration the national regulations. There are key principles that underpin all of the rules and regulations, and this is where some people say barriers, but I wouldn't necessarily say barriers. These are the things that we have to take into consideration when putting out a tender. These principles, the key principles, the three key principles are transparency, equal treatment, and non-discrimination. The various rules and regulations that are in place, no matter what you do, you always have to ensure that those three key principles are always there. We have to be transparent. If we have a contract going out, we have to give everyone the opportunity to win that contract. So that's why you can't just go knock on the school's door. The next rule that I think would be useful to tell you about is aggregation. So the rules that must be followed for each contract depends on the aggregated spend of the council on that product or group of products. For example, the rules that must be followed for a small contract are not as stringent as they are around a multi-million-pound contract. With the purchase of foods, we sit in the middle of those two extremes. If we were to look at each single school, then their spend would fall under the lower threshold and the process would not be as stringent. However, the regulations specify that all spend by the council must be aggregated. And aggregation refers to the combining of all the spends for similar products. So we then have to look at the spend across the whole council and not just the spend of each individual school. For Aberdeenshire Council, this includes the spend across all of the primary and secondary schools, catering teams, the nurseries, the home economics departments, the care homes, and so on. For Aberdeen City, it also includes the civic offerings such as the beach ballroom. So, you all of a sudden that spend can go from that local school and how much they spend on their lunch to a much, much larger figure. And therefore, because it's a higher threshold, there's stricter rules that we have to follow. The process itself, so this leads us nicely into the process that must be followed. As aforementioned, the process varies depending on the monetary value of the contract. In all cases, the council have an obligation to seek best value for money. So that's where I have to disagree with you. It's not the cheapest. It's not the cheapest. It's the best value for money. So it's the cheapest. That's how you're gauged. We judge it by quality and price, and that is in the regulations. You cannot award a contract based on price alone. It has to be price and quality, and the ratio between that has to be established at the start. So yeah, it's not the cheapest. So yeah, best value for money refers not only to the cost, but also the quality. For higher threshold contracts, this is ascertained by the way of a public tender. The councils have to create tender documentation that clearly explains the requirements and the expectations. These are to be advertised on Public Contract Scotland and all suppliers invited to tender on these. There are many rules and tendering processes to ensure that these key principles are upheld, and these are around the advertisement, the communication with suppliers, evaluation and award. We could go into each of those in a lot more detail, but definitely wouldn't be under the 5 minutes. So we'll move on to frameworks and dynamic purchasing systems. So some of you may have heard of these terms before. If you haven't, don't worry. As I said, I didn't know what they were until I got into public procurement. These are agreements that once established can be used to call off contracts. Although the term is very, very taboo in public procurement and not something that we encourage, so don't tell anyone I said this, it is like a pre-approved supplier list where all of the suppliers pass mandatory requirements to be on the said list. To establish the framework or the dynamic purchasing system, they do have to still go through the full tendering process. So they have all been pre-qualified and they do meet the minimum requirements. For most of the councils, food contracts, there are national agreements that can be utilised, and the organisation that establishes these for local councils is called Scotland Excel. And quite often when people contact us and say, how do we supply the council, we would point them to Scotland Excel and say, please, please get on Scotland Excel. I know there was a lot of work done with a local fruit and veg supplier who is now into the second generation of a Scotland Excel, and we're able to go to them directly, and they are based in Turriff. So that's great for us that we're using a local supplier. The main difference between a framework and a DPS, because I think we'll probably talk about dynamic procurement a bit later, is once established, a framework is closed. So those people who are on that framework are the only people you can go to. Whereas in a dynamic purchasing system, it remains open, so people can apply to join at any point. So what are we doing at the moment? I'm nearly at the end, I promise. So now we have a better understanding of the rules and the regulations. Let's talk about why we're here today, local supply. What is done to encourage more local suppliers? We have lotting. There is a requirement that we do look at lotting our contracts to try and make them more appealing to SMEs, make them regional, do things like that so that, yeah, and we have to justify if we're not lotting them as well. There's the supply development programme and there's the business gateway as well. So these are organisations that assist SMEs and small companies get into public procurement because it can be daunting when you look at a big tender document. We also have Meet the Buyer events where you can come along and actually speak to the council and speak to the people doing the public procurement, and they'll tell you when the contracts are due to end and things like that. And then there's Public Contract Scotland, which is the national portal for public procurement adverts in Scotland. Everything has to be advertised on there. So anyone at any point can go on and view exactly what the council requirements are. What more can be done? This is obviously the bit that's to try and generate some talk after I finished. From my personal opinion, I think that more collaborative working. So as you were saying about the Kent farmers, you know, this idea of suppliers coming together. We find, particularly for Aberdeenshire, it's such a large area that a small producer in the north of Aberdeenshire is not able to supply their products to the south of Aberdeenshire. But this idea of suppliers coming together and working together to meet the requirements is a really good idea, but it needs the buy-in from the suppliers. Innovation, there's a big push on innovation at the moment. I don't know if there's any innovative solutions to food procurement, but you never know what's around the corner. So if anyone does have any innovative ideas. More national frameworks with direct suppliers. We find that the national frameworks that Scotland Excel set up, some of them do have the opportunity for direct suppliers. So they don't have to worry about the logistics of getting the produce to the schools. They just have to worry about producing enough of the product. We have had success with that with a local fishery up on the north coast who supplies to the frozen framework, and they don't have to worry then about the delivery. That's all done by a different company. So that I think would be a really good push, but that needs buy-in from the likes of Scotland Excel to implement direct suppliers into more of their frameworks. We would also like to see more regional national frameworks. Scotland Excel themselves are based down in the Central Belt. So the lot of work that they do with suppliers is down in the Central Belt. We would love to have something more north, especially with the size of Highlands, the size of Aberdeenshire. It would be really good to, yeah, get that. And then the more dynamic approach, which I think we're probably going to cover a bit later, but this needs more buy-in and it needs more support for us as procurement experts on how we can do that within the remits of the regulations. And then that kind of brings me on nicely to the last bit, which is the revision of the rules and the regulations. Previously, our rules and regulations were heavily dependent on what the EU said. Post-Brexit, the UK government have recently undergone a massive exercise, completely revamping their public procurement regulations. Unfortunately, because, well, not unfortunately, I think, fortunately, we have got devolved for public procurement. So those regulations will not be coming into play in Scotland. But it does mean that it's a great time now for the Scottish Government to look at the regulations and what changes can be made. For example, around aggregation of the contracts and things like that. As I don't know what the exact answer is, but hopefully that's given you some ideas as to what the potential barriers and potential solutions might be.
Perfect, Kim. And I'm guessing as local authorities, you are all working together with a Good Food Nation consultation and feeding this all back in. And yes, yeah.
So we have our procurement team who work with the services. The services themselves tend to work with the Good Food Nation and the extending milk to extra children, and yeah. So I can't say that I'm an expert in that, but yeah.
So has anyone got questions? Here we are. Yeah. Oh, no. Okay. So just introduce yourself and then ask your question.
So I'm Maria de la Torre from Nature Scott. So thank you very much for hosting this. Just a quick question. I mean, fascinating to hear about that. And I suppose there are, it's good to think about what are the opportunities, and, you sort of flash those at the end about, thinking how could we make it easier for smaller producers or smaller cooperatives to access some of that. And I suppose, part of it has to come from what we ask for in our procurement process, perhaps giving a stronger role to sustainability, fresh produce that could then, give an opportunity to some of those, diversifying a little bit more the way we produce. I think I was just wanting to introduce something a little bit different, which is about the fact that it's so important to be able to reach to schools and hospitals. I'm just thinking that, this is the food that they were talking about the next generation, and if they are not educated in how to eat good food, then we're never going to change, and improve our food system. So I think it is quite key to perhaps look at how we can develop systems that do think about the quality of and how we introduce some of these changes across. So thank you.
I'm Andrew Whitley from Scott and the Bread. A question and a couple of observations. I'll come to the question afterwards. Two observations. One is that on the issue of collaborative marketing and Gail's point about a successful project in Kent, I don't know how many of you are aware of Mosgiel organic milk. I understand that Mosgiel, despite heroic efforts to get organic milk into public procurement and into more sort of radical public vending and that kind of thing, but particularly with a contract with East Ayrshire, I think, and they've gone out of business, haven't they? They've just gone bust. I was told the other day that they've just gone bust.
What's the contract?
Right. Well, I'm really pleased to hear that, but because yes, it was reported as such. The other observation is that, in a sense, supporting what Bob said, I have actually seen a public procurement contract for the supply of £4 million worth of morning rolls for a central belt local authority, in which the quality criteria had all been redacted out in black impermeable ink, except for low price. So that was a few years ago, but not that many. And it raises the question as to who actually curates or manages those quality criteria. Is it perhaps all too easy for somebody making that judgment about how they're going to actually determine a contract to go to the only company that's available by virtue of size to fulfill that criterion? And they say, well, we know that there are only one or two players in this business who can actually supply that because of aggregation. And therefore, we're going to just beat them down on price because then they're never going to meet any nutritional criteria. Were we minded to introduce those? So there's an awful self-fulfilling prophecy about this process, which seems to me to be one of the first positive things that one could do with get rid of it, get some real nutritional values in there and criteria, and put some sort of spine behind the local authority procurement teams. It needs to be, of course, furnished with more money because there never is enough money to pay for those additional nutritional standards. Yeah, well, I did embed the question, who decides? What is how does it work?
So when developing the quality criteria, we as procurement, we work with the services, we ensure that they understand the rules and the regulations around it. So it does have to be applicable to the contract itself. It has to be, we can't ask someone a question about something that has nothing to do with what we're actually tendering for. I was really surprised at you saying about it being redacted and being price only, because that is really not, I wouldn't say within the regulations, it would be, I wouldn't feel very comfortable with that. We always have to, whenever, from procurement side of things, and I think I'm slightly biased because I come from a legal background, we always have to think about what if we were challenged. When we do the evaluations, we make sure that everyone evaluates. When we come up with the quality criteria itself, we make sure that it's relevant, that it's appropriate, and that the splitting of the values is going to get us best value for money, which, as I was saying before, it's not just, you'll sometimes see a 60-40 split between 60 price, 40 quality, and then other times you'll see 60 quality and 40 price, and sometimes higher, because it depends on what it is we're going out for. Given the additional rules that have come in around the nutritional requirements in school meals, there are a lot of strict rules now that we have to ensure that we embed in our ITTs and our tender documents. So they have to meet these requirements. They cannot provide us with certain products that are full of sugar, that are full of salts. You know, that's not allowed now under the Scottish Government. I don't know the ins and outs of those because that's more to the service and the catering side of things. But I know that when we're creating the tender documents, that certainly has to be built into them. When it comes to evaluation, that's when we make sure that everyone does it individually and that we come together for consensus, make sure that it has been evaluated fairly and that notes are kept, because at any point, if someone thinks that it's not been done correctly, they can go to the courts and they can have a look at all of the documents and they can say, well, no, you've got to restart that whole process. And that's going to be much more costly to the council than it would have been had the process been followed correctly.
Davy McCracken from Scotland's Rural College. Just to be clear though, from Andrew's question, what you're saying is local authorities, or the combined local authorities that are working here, yes, there's a set of rules and regulations that they have to work to that comes down from a national level. But in terms of setting the quality standard you want for the procurement, that sits very much with the local authority.
Yes, so we get to choose what the questions are and what's important, but there are rules around that surrounding, as I said before. Yes, yes. So what's yes, yes. Sorry.
Perfect. So I don't know, would this be a good time, Andrew, to put your provocation about nutritional mandate minimum standards for bread making grains, flour and bread?
I've got a handout here. Perhaps you could.
Do you want me to hold and
just
all right, do you want me to
spread them around? Yes.
Yes.
So that I remind myself.
You keep mine off.
You could just send those around. So this is a summary. I'm Andrew Whitley, Chair of Scotland the Bread, which is better known as Bread for Good Community Benefit Society. We're a charity researching grain on the Balcaski estate in Fife, and milling it into flour, wholemeal flour, and working with communities to try and get more better bread into the neediest stomachs in Scotland. And we have an ambition to change the bread system from the bottom up for good, in both senses of that word, in terms of it being a good thing to do, but also in a sense of enduring. And it's really lovely to see diversity is the key to building resilience. Yeah, indeed. There, because some of us have been battling to understand the implications of that for quite some years. We have a project in Scotland the Bread called Soil to Slice, where we work with community groups, gardening groups and others to grow some of the diverse grains that we are researching and follow them through from growing to a simple hand harvest and threshing and milling, and then sharing as bread in a communal meal, trying to open out what actually that series of vital relationships, the kind of golden thread of diversity that potentially can run right through our food system, what that might do for people, not just in terms of better nutrition and reduction in ill health, but actually how they feel about themselves, their fellow citizens and the rest of society. And so I completely get why Gail wanted us to be positive about this, but you can't be positive about bread in Scotland as it is at the moment. You have to set the scene as to why we need some pretty radical changes to make it better, which is where I've identified these problems. For those who can't see this, I've simply pointed to the issue frequently in the past of Scotland growing around about 1 million tons of wheat a year, somewhere between 800,000 and 1 million tons of wheat. It would take somewhere between 150,000 and 200,000 of those tons if they were grown from bread making varieties to make all Scotland's bread. But currently less than 1,000 tons of that 1 million is actually used for making bread in Scotland. And so the rest of it is used for animal feed and increasingly for alcohol, cheap alcohol production and bioethanol, which I regard as a public health scandal, as well as being a kind of quintessential definition of food insecurity. If Scotland is really so profligate in its use of its own land that it can use some of the best land and very high levels of artificial fertilizer as well in the main to produce a product which is not actually feeding people directly at all. And if it does, the bit that does go into animal feed is obviously at a conversion ratio which is considerably less advantageous than simply making it into well-fermented bread. And I've pointed here to the fact that agronomy, the way we actually do grow our crops, really matters, that there is research which shows that it does make a difference what you spray onto the field, how you look after the soil. It gets terribly nerdy here, but just to point out one feature, the routine spraying of urea onto bread making varieties of grain, or at least to push the protein level of grain up so that farmers can get a milling premium, has been shown to double the expression of a omega-5 gliadin protein, which is implicated in quite a lot of allergy and intolerance in people who eat bread made with that kind of flour. And there are all kinds of other issues about plant growth regulators widely used in non-organic agriculture, and glyphosate herbicide as well, residues of that in 1 in every 3 slices, according to the UK government, of white bread. So this is the background to a perfect storm of food insecurity and widening health inequalities, and the perversity of the approaches that we're taking at the moment to solving this problem, which are broadly trying to leave the structure, the delivery structure in place, but to encourage those who are supplying it to do a little bit better. So reformulation. I was at an Innovate or interface conference on Monday in Edinburgh about reformulation, and there's been a small amount of money given to people in something called the Healthier Bakery Fund. And so there's supposed to be removing fat, salt and sugar from products, and there was a lot of cheering about the number of tons of fat that a certain company had taken out of its meat pies and so on. But the overall framing of it, which was described by Food Standards Scotland, was that the situation about consumption of these things, saturated fat, salt and sugar, is actually getting worse in Scotland overall. And indeed, one of the perversities of reformulation, which she described without any hint of irony, was that the reduction in sugar due to the sugar levy has resulted in an increase in the consumption and sales of soft drinks. And her words were, so no problems for the food and drink industry there then. And I couldn't believe I was actually hearing those words. But of course, all the other people in the audience were people making that kind of stuff and wanting to tick some boxes by reducing the amount of saturated fat or salt or sugar in their particular thing. But if you do that, then you end up by stimulating the sale of products that are fundamentally not nutritive. And if they are themselves dependent on an agricultural step, which is also damaging to biodiversity, soil life, and so on, then you have a complete disjunction here, which we really need to deal with. So my provocation is to suggest that we go to where it all began. And I love the idea of faith beginning with a tree. But I would also say that there's a Russian proverb. I'll preface this by saying that my first exposure to buckwheat was going on a Soviet ship from Tilbury to Leningrad in 1968 to start my year at Moscow University. And the first morning we went down from our cabins to breakfast and were presented with a quite disgusting porridge made of buckwheat, which I absolutely disliked. But so then did I dislike the sourdough rye bread that I had to eat as a student at the university, of course, for only about a week. And then I began to love it and understand why Russians so revere bread. And they say everything begins with bread. You know, bread is the head of everything. And of course, that's true in a very direct sense, because even in the late 19th century, poorer people in Scotland and in England, places like Glasgow, where the Cross Maloof bakery was started as an attempt to try and raise standards and create availability for better bread. They were dependent for bread on 75, 80% of their diet. And even now, although it's kind of dismissed as a kind of also ran in the important nutritional stakes, actually bread is still a staple product. So it does matter how we make it and what we put into it. And so my positive proposal is that we should mandate minimum standards for bread making grains, flour and bread, to address nutrient density, digestibility, local accessibility, and the one thing that I left off there, which I should add, which is health inequalities. Now, just a couple of things to reinforce that by reference to things that we've done successfully in the past and which we could easily learn from. In the Second World War, when wheat supplies were massively constrained by U-boat action, the government instituted a policy of stopping millers from milling white flour, forcing the extraction rate up to 85, 90%. And they also created a thing called the National Wheatmeal Loaf, which was subsidized and remained subsidized until 1956, when it was finally withdrawn. But it had more fiber in it, and therefore more B vitamins and other benefits of the fiber in the bread. But the other thing that they did, which was unseen by everybody at the time, because it was such a clever piece of public policy, was to pass a regulation that all bakers had to keep their bread for 1 day before selling it. National consumption of bread dropped immediately, because as anyone who's ever made their own loaf of bread or has been persuaded to buy something with crumb softening enzymes in it, i.e. 99% of all British bread, knows you can eat that stuff till the cows come home without feeling full. And freshly baked bread without additives in overcomes the satiety mechanism. That's why when in the Second World War, consumption dropped when people were eating the very same bread after it had sat in the baker's shop for a day, because at that time they didn't put any additives in to make it stay soft and fresh, so-called. Bit of a misuse of language there, but for many weeks or months, as that stuff does now. Now, you know, this is an example of how a little bit of sort of push and pull can transform the situation wonderfully. So we're suggesting that we set new standards for minimum nutritional quality for bread, everyday bread. It's not stopping people from making croissants or anything like that. Just saying, if it's going to be the kind of food that people depend on for their basics, for sandwiches, for morning rolls and that kind of thing, then let's mandate standards which actually accord with the best nutritional advice. And Wendy can tell us exactly what we need to have there in terms of balance. Where are we going to get that from? Not from engineering enzymes that somehow miraculously convert base metals into gold in our bread system, but actually by looking at the varieties that we can grow in Scottish soils, which have more naturally occurring zinc, magnesium, iron, calcium, the important things that bread can give us. But we also need to make sure that the soils are capable of actually delivering those nutrients, which means that the whole cycle has got to be in sync. And that's the thing about the diversity, whether it's in the soil on your plate or in your gut, absolutely true. The problem is at the moment we have a system where a bit of attention is being paid to soil diversity, and certainly we know a lot about gut diversity. And in the middle, between those two things, we've got a food system which is seemingly immovably monoclonal in terms of grains, monocultural and monopolistic in terms of social delivery, because you can't get better bread unless you have a certain income and a certain geographical location, because you can't just go to your local supermarket and get anything that is remotely like the kind of standard that we would wish to set. So what we're thinking about is, yeah, I'll wind up. Yeah. Okay. I've put all the kind of academic detail in the back for those of you who are interested, just comparing artificial fortification with setting minimum standards for nutritional flour, because if we set those standards, we could create a pull right back to plant breeding, to farming, to milling, to baking, and then through to consumer preference. And I think this is this question of getting everybody around the table and saying, what would constitute the answer to the problems we have of overconsumption of under-nutritional foods. And so it's summed up in that slogan that we put at the bottom: fewer slices of more nutrient-dense bread from Scottish soils means less pressure on your belt, your budget, and the biosphere. Thank you very much.
So yeah, I guess with a son and daughter that eat bread every day on school dinners, that could be absolutely game changing if we could change that nutritional quality of the bread that they currently are served, because I know the bread isn't great at all. Cheese roll every day. So I'm going to open up, we've got 5 minutes, and I'm going to open up questions, and then we're going to break for another artistic interlude.
Yeah, I'm going to come back a little bit to local food with respect to bread, just to give you an indicate what happened in Huntly the last year and the year before. Now, you got to forgive me because I can't remember all the names that were used, but there was a little, it was part of a kind of artistic and community that was set up, and they made local bread from local wheat as well, and they provided it to the population. Devon Project did. And that, I'm going to come back to the central issue I was talking about earlier on. There was no support mechanism to keep that going. This is why you've got to go back to a form of support mechanism like the producer organisations, you know, where you take a top slice off the 600 odd million that's paid out to farmers every year, and you create another mechanism to support that local food infrastructure, because people will do it. It's just there's no incentive for them to do it at the minute, because you've got to compete against the Warburtons of this world that, you know, basically produce polystyrene when it comes out the toaster. Brilliant stuff.
Sorry, just to follow on from that, the lady that used to do the baking there, and she now does her own bread, and she's at the Huntly Farmers Market every month, and the queue is unbelievable.
Every day.
Yeah. And I think, but it kind of leads on to people do want it. You know, there's a need and there's a want for it, and she sells out in no time at all. And it's how good it is.
Perfect. Okay, so this now breaks. We're going to have a nice little artistic interlude, just to get us refreshed. And this is Dawn is going to sit up and recite in our in my hand. Oh.
Her ears must be burning now. Actually, can I ask you, because I've got my hand, can I ask you to hold that for me? Well, we've been talking a lot about, obviously, about the earth and about growing, and it's really heartening listening to everyone. There's some really positive ideas, and living in Huntly, I just think this is all so important. I'd love to see people in this market square every day. If there were stalls there every day, and not just the first Saturday in every month, that'd be a game changer. That really would. This Saturday coming, is it? Yeah, this Saturday coming. Yeah, yeah. Farmers market this Saturday. If anyone's. So I'm kidding myself without my glasses. It's lovely to be inside right now after having done some. It's not often I get to genuinely say that I've been outstanding in the field. Well, outstanding in that field, definitely this morning. So, and these poems were all inspired by what we've been talking about today. And this one's called In My Hand. In my hand, I hold the hours and the power of our muscles that tilled the soil. I hold the work that we have done this day and the countless longer ones before it, as we readied this land for farming. In my hand, I hold the seasons and the reasons for the first green shoots of spring. I hold the lush growth of summer and the voluptuous abundance of an autumn that will roll into the long winter rest. In my hand, I hold the years and the fears that lurk as we nurture the tiny things. I hold the journey spent from fragile seedling to great tree of shade and shelter that will withstand the wind and rain. In my hand, I hold time and the climb towards the light above. I hold the elements of all that went before, a physical memory, this tangible reminder, a dirty clod. In my hand, I hold the earth. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you. So we've got 5 minutes. Does anybody want to comment on the poem, or is there more questions about the provocations that we've just heard this afternoon, or any more ideas? Or yes.
Just following on from some of the themes. Andy from Scottish Big Producers. The livestock's a pretty central part of the farming up around here and for most parts of Scotland, and a persistent theme is the perceived lack of abattoir provision. And the reason I say perceived is there's actually overcapacity in Scotland for slaughtering provision. It's just not in the right place. So the challenge is not physically building new abattoirs. It's a logistical thing, and it's a coordination thing, which brings us back to producer organizations and cooperation. And if we can crack that, we can bundle up efficient logistics of moving livestock to the abattoirs, which are sitting half empty, and bring the stock back in an efficient manner in refrigerated transport, and then do the distribution to the local areas from there. You don't have to have an abattoir on your doorstep, but you do need to turn live animals into meat in a hygienic fashion if you're going to sell it to anybody. So it's think about how you coordinate yourselves, and that would be an awful lot quicker than building a new abattoir.
James Yoxall from Grampian Grazers, beef producer. I understand what you're saying, but that again comes back to a bit what Bob was saying about it's a corporate food system. You know, yes, we've got abattoirs that are probably underutilized somewhere, but actually we just need to break those abattoirs in half and just distribute them more evenly across the country so that high welfare standards can be met for those livestock that are being produced and sent to slaughter for our nutritional needs.
So just while we're on the case of realism, the pig sector's over dependent on a single abattoir. It was farmer owned, so it's producer owned up until quite recently. And when we looked at what would be involved with building an abattoir and the system, you know, like for like as it was, 40 million quid, and that's one. So we can build a smaller abattoir for less than that, absolutely. But I've had the same discussion in Dalbeattie, in Skye, in Loch Arbor, in the Borders. You know, there are dozens of parts of Scotland that say they want an abattoir. And in 20 years of being listening to this stuff, we've built none. So we need to think differently and move away from the bricks and mortar and think about how do you do it. You don't have to give the ownership to the people. What I'm saying is you pay them to do a service, and then that's the end of their involvement with it. You keep the ownership, you run the thing, you run the co-op, farmer owned, farmer controlled.
Yeah, I'd like to, Johnny Balfour from Pasture for Life. We are very fortunate in Fife to be quite close to a very large abattoir. And if what you're saying is true and it's just a logistical problem, the abattoir that is 25 minutes by car, so let's say 35 or 40 with a float, we can't use it because they will only accept farm kills once a month in a, you know, when it's a blue moon. Given that that abattoir is owned by a very large corporate, they are not incentivized in any way to take small farm. Well, in our case, we're very fortunate. We're a big farm, but we're still very small business compared to them. If we're taking 5 animals to them, they just don't need to know about it, because what they want is 40 animals delivered at a time on the back of a lorry.
So I'm not disagreeing really with this, but if we're talking about policy decisions and so on like that, that company is also in receipt of a grant of 7 million quid. Why was that not a condition of the grant? That you do facilitate the and have a serious discussion about how you can make these things work. You know, it's not about these supply chains. 93% of people buy their food from the supermarket, so those supply chains are also needed. So it's not about wrecking that side in order to make other parts of it work. It's about saying, how do you develop something that is a bit more the way we would ultimately like it to be, which is local.
It's getting those businesses, those retailers, to take the responsibility and make, as in the government, as of what we're finding, citizens want the retailers and consumer businesses to take brave decisions, and it is, we're not going to change our food systems without them moving as well. You know, we can do so much locally and individually, but yeah, it's a big problem, big challenge. Okay, David, yeah, come on in.
David Miller, James Hutton Institute, just picking up on the same theme and reflecting on some of the sessions in the November Scotland's Rural and Island Parliament. There was a session in the field dedicated to this, and it was the on-farm kill and the issue that you've just raised, which was a key point about the distance that individuals had to travel to get to a limited number of abattoirs, particularly when one was in the north and the west. And indeed, one of the farms of example was in Aberlour, so not very far, not remote in some senses, but remote in terms of that resource. But the other observation made by a farmer not far from Lumphanan, so closer to here, also in one sense not remote, but too remote for a butcher. Moving to having on-farm butchery so that they could comply with certain regulations, and finding that they could eventually recruit a butcher, but a butcher who couldn't drive and therefore could not get to Lumphanan. And the observation I just wanted to make was when careers teachers and schools are going round the class and asking what people want to be, how many hands go up to be a butcher or other key parts of our food system that perhaps we overlook and don't invest in, and don't see what the career development would be for those key individuals.
And we're at a completely amazing time in Scotland, aren't we? Because we're starting to look at our ag budget and our knowledge exchange budget, and we're starting to co-design these. And I think there's a big opportunity here about how we spend that public investment and how we align it with private investment and make it work. So I'm going to give everyone a quick comfort break. So 5 minutes, do stretch your legs, jump up and down, get some energy, because we've got another session, going into another session, and we'll have another 2 artistic interludes in the next half. But thank you, everyone. That was fantastic. And see you back here in 5 minutes. Hello, welcome back, everybody. That was very well done, just slightly over 5 minutes. So I'm going to hand over to Sarah McFadgen now, and she's going to sing a song called The Earth is at the Heart. Hello again.
This is just a wee song thinking about fertility and health and beauty, and how humans' health is so very interlinked with the Earth's health.
Sandra's got a job in the fields. Working her nails is the deal. She'll do anything for that dirty nailed look. Red painted nails she never did suit. Sandra is looking for a fungi with a decent plant root. Some folks say she's a dirty-nailed freak, but she's as fertile as the soil beneath her feet. She gets her nails done through the week, so she's ready to go out Friday. She's on a winning streak, that dirty-nailed freak. Sandra is the queen of the compost. Silt, clay or sand, she's your man. Take her out for curry and talk about your slurry. Makes her a super flirt, she'll fairly cultivate your dirt. She gets her nails done through the week, so she's ready to go out Friday. She's on a winning streak, that dirty-nailed freak. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times. Sandra likes a man with a spade, a good seed sowing escapade. Take care of this ground and watch it grow, and what springs up you'll never know. She gets her nails done through the week, so she's ready to go out Friday. She's on a winning streak, that dirty-nailed freak. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times. This earth is at the heart of all of our good times.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sarah. I think there's a whole load of dirty-nailed freaks in this room at the moment and at home. So our online audience have been really patient, and I think there's quite a few questions coming. So we're going to, I think I'm going to get the laptop and I'll start to pose these to the relevant people. Okay, so let me see.
Tell us how many you're online.
36 people. Okay. Okay, I'm going to start with funding. Okay. And this is a question about from Lin Lang. Is there knowledge in the room regarding the lack of funding support for local food resilience schemes? For example, less than 3 hectares for cross and smallholders in the new agricultural bill going through. And I know David from the Soil Association can fill us in a bit about the campaign that's going on at the moment and maybe a bit of update of where we think we're getting to.
Yeah. Well, thanks very much. Yeah, David Mackay, Soil Association. So as Kirsty says, there's a campaign incorporating Scottish Crofting Federation, Nourish Scotland, Land Workers Alliance, Soil Association and Propagate, and I think possibly Pasture for Life, but you can correct me if I'm wrong, Johnny. And this is looking at ways in which the new support scheme that's going to be kicking in to replace the cap in Scotland can better support smaller producers. So at the moment, if you are below the 3 hectare threshold, you're not eligible for basic payments, for example. And I must declare a personal interest in this as well as a small scale organic veg grower. We don't receive any support from government. And when I was advised to apply through the agri-environment scheme, we were knocked back this past year. I think that there's an argument to be made for the amount of food that can be produced on a very small or relatively small piece of land. So I was at an event yesterday in the Scottish Parliament with all those organisations and a whole load of farmers and crofters who've taken part in a knowledge transfer project over the past year called Agroecology Strengthening Livelihoods. And we had Joe Hunt from Knockfarrell Produce in Dingwall, who was serving 220 families with weekly veg boxes from his croft. He's made a decision this year not to plant anything at all, such as the challenge around increased costs, and essentially made the point last night that he would go out of business if he tried this year. And that was followed up by another grower from Perthshire who also reported that he wasn't growing anything this year. So I think we've got a real challenge here if those decisions are being made at a time when we've got the ambition to become a good food nation, a national food plan being published. We want local food strategies, or at least the government says it does. So we need the agriculture bill to work for all sizes of farm. Yes, we need scale, of course, but we also need to make sure, if we can, that it works for smaller producers.
Perfect. I have a few questions have come in on growing specific types of food. So I think, Wendy, these questions might be for you. So there's a knowledge on blaeberries. Is it possible to grow and produce sufficient pulses and legumes in Scotland to support a healthy diet? And how might hemp be included in our diet? So there's 3 there, so just come back to me.
Okay, I'll save hemp to the last because I'm a bit evangelical when it comes to hemp. So blaeberries, yes, they're a really healthy, they're difficult to harvest, obviously. Everyone knows that you go out and, you know, even with a comb, they're quite difficult to harvest. But when we've studied them compared to other soft fruits, they're so high, magnitudes higher in anthocyanins, which are the things that everyone thinks are really healthy. So the Scottish blaeberry is an amazing soft fruit. And that's one of the reasons I think we should think about how we use our marginal lands. And I think if we get some of these into the food system, it would be great. So yeah, I'm all in favour of the blaeberry. In fact, we ran a human study where we showed we lowered blood sugar with a blaeberry extract, you know, and, you know, soft fruits are considered high in sugar. So it's nice to know that there are some benefits above sugar in these soft fruits. The second one, beans and peas. Yeah, beans and peas are great because they are a good replacement for meat. So if you're partially trying to replace meat in your diet, they're easily substituted into menus. So, you know, I think that is a good use of peas and beans. We studied them alongside hemp. The reason we've promoted hemp more than the others, I think, is the real environmental benefits that hemp brings. I think, you know, hemp is a star of a crop. You know, the oil that comes from hemp is better for you than rapeseed oil and olive oil, high in omega-3. So if, you know, our population would consume more hemp oil rather than the other oils, they'd be healthier. But when you press for oil, you get a flour that you can use in the bacon industry. And then, of course, there's the fibre that can be used as building materials. You know, the fact that the whole plant can be used is really valuable, and it uses less nutrients and less pesticides, and it grows on more marginal land. So, you know, it's something that we would really advocate and really would like to see a lot grown. We only need to grow about 0.25 million hectares to have a significant reduction in emissions. So, you know, I think the calculation was around 10 to 20% reduction in emissions if we had enough hemp grown in Scotland. So it's a fabulous crop.
And add to that, because from the below and benefits as well, we did a little pilot study with Wendy and colleagues at the Rowett, and there was a measurable effect of an increase in the soil organic matter from one season's growth of a hemp crop. pH was raised. It was quite amazing. So we're going to have to trial that again just to confirm those findings. But also it's a phytoremediator. So if you have toxic elements, so the bad guys in your soil, you can grow hemp and it removes it and it can be taken away and make that soil well again.
Nightmare.
Yeah, so the Scottish Government are really addressing that. We've quite a few MSPs are contacting and speaking to DEFRA about trying to move the legislation. It's been dropped throughout Europe. It's not fair for our farmers that we still have legislation in Scotland.
That's a clear ask. Note that down, Davy. So there's another couple of questions here, and I think we can probably tie these into procurement and what David from the Soil Association is going to just give a brief overview of their oh my goodness, sorry, David, my brain's going. So I'm going to ask the couple of questions just to, so you bear this in mind when you do your provocation. What are the weightings for price quality, and does quality include aspects relevant to community wealth building and transition or soil quality biodiversity? So is there any local authorities taking that into account at the moment? And the other is the fear actual or imagined of legal challenge to policy on the basis of competition, which might enable local food systems, e.g. favouring local food and procurement, or the ideal of opening up market squares? So I don't know if, so maybe if you, I'm sure you can include that in.
So do you want me to go ahead with what I was going to say first?
And then we'll provocation, and then we can maybe.
I need to think. I'm not sure I have all the answers to some of those questions, but I'll do my best. Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about Food for Life, which is a program that Soil Association has been running for more than 10 years now, and really based on the premise of the power of local food and the benefits that it can deliver for health, for the environment, and for local economies. The way in which we do this is working with school caterers in local authorities across Scotland to get more fresh, sustainable and local produce into school lunches. At the moment, we are working with just over half of the 32 councils in Scotland, and that means we're serving about 111,000 Food for Life served here school meals a day. The system works, if you're not familiar with it, on an award system. So there's 3 ratings: bronze, silver and gold. Bronze is the entry level, where there are requirements, for example, around having 75% of ingredients freshly prepared. Red meat has to be QMS farm assured. The chicken has to be Red Tractor accredited, etc. As you move up, there's an encouragement to try and incorporate more organic ingredients. So silver has a 5% organic requirement, and the gold standard is a 15% organic requirement. So there's been successes through the program, and we've talked about, Mossgiel was one example, and it's unfortunate that what has recently happened down there. There have been successes elsewhere, but there are also some real challenges. And right now, the biggest one is pressure on local authority budgets. We're dealing with a lot of councils who are saying that even the cost of farm assured meat, which is nowhere near, for example, the price if you were trying, for example, to get organic chicken, it'd be a massive difference. Even at that bronze level, there's huge difficulties. Now, we need to have a serious conversation, I think, about how local government is funded. And I think this is a personal view more than a Soil Association view, but if you have a situation where local government doesn't have control over local taxation and revenue generation, then I'm not sure that in any meaningful way that constitutes local government. And I think that councillors are in an invidious position at the moment where they're having to make some pretty horrendous decisions around cuts to really important public services, whether that's education or care for the elderly or roads maintenance. And I wouldn't want to be in their shoes at all. Here in Aberdeenshire last week, the council made a decision to withdraw from Food for Life, and it was a relatively small saving, but I'm not going to criticise the political administration for that decision, because I could see from the list of measures that there was horrendous choices that are having to make. So I do think there's a serious conversation there around that needs to be had around how we're funding our local authorities. Other barriers from the producer standpoint, I think this has been touched upon a couple of times today, is that kind of the procurement process and that the bidding in for contracts is quite complex. It can be very daunting and quite challenging. So as Kim outlined, some of the requirements, for example, on processing. So if you're a veg producer, the vegetables have to be washed, peeled, diced, packaged before they can be sold in. Now, if you're a smaller producer, you're probably not going to be able to do that. And I think to some degree there's an argument as to why. I know there's reasons for why those rules exist, but if you're a small producer, it can be quite difficult to get around that. So, and the other challenge that I was going to talk about was processing, and that I think I've covered that a little bit in terms of the lack of infrastructure required. So, you know, at a local level, I might make a couple of suggestions, and you guys can feel free to knock them down to tell me that we're wrong. But one area where I think might be helpful in terms of helping local producers is to have local coordinator posts, so essentially a go-between between local producers, primary producers, and the local council to help remove some of those barriers around the process. And we have one person in the Soil Association Food for Life team who currently does that. She does an amazing job, and she was, you know, for example, with Mosquito, she worked for a number of years to get that over the line with Bryce. And it takes time to build relationships, it takes time to build trust, etc. But that's one person for 17 councils that we work with, and there are 32 in Scotland. So I think that might go some way to helping to remove some of those barriers to local producers getting in. I think we have also in the past discussed the potential for amending some of those procurement rules. For example, around including targets to help drive progress towards more local sourcing, and also to include point of origin information in local contract, public sector contract requirements. At the moment, when we try to assess how much local produce is going in, it can be quite deceptive. So you have wholesalers, for example, who have a Scottish address and they're counted as local suppliers, but actually that produce is coming from England, sometimes from further afield. So we need to be a bit more close in a bit more on what actually constitutes local supply, and it would be good if that could be provided. And finally, on the processing point, we've talked around this a little bit today. And I think Andy's made some really good points around abattoirs, but I do wonder whether it might be worth the councils collectively thinking about a feasibility study into a central hub for processing, which might include, you know, some of the vegetable processing that I mentioned, and that could also maybe include distribution as well. There was something came up last night at the parliamentary event. I mentioned Joe Hunt at Knockfarrell, and Joe at one point, he said, had the opportunity to bid into the contract with Highland Council. And I think he said at one year he was looking like he might get it, but Highland Council area is enormous. And if you're a producer in Dingwall and you're trying to service every school in that local authority area, which I think is about the size of Belgium, with over 100 different schools, then you know it's not possible for local producers to contemplate that. But if there was some sort of distribution scheme, if you could aggregate produce and then distribute it out, then I think that's at least worth a feasibility study to see if that's something that might be possible. But thanks very much.
Perfect. Brilliant. Thank you, David. So I guess it'd be great to open up to the room now. I think that's covered most of the questions from online for the moment. And I guess people who maybe live locally or have farms or work for the council, is there any thoughts that you have? I mean, even responding to David there and his thoughts, what might happen, and are they possible, or what, you know, what's happening at the moment and what might be possible?
Sorry, Stuart Dons from NHS Grampian. So I think a lot of the similar procurement issues you were mentioning, being a local authority and that. We were actually a few years ago, I put a lot of effort of trying to get the Food for Life scheme, and we were, I was going to say wrong, we're a millimetre away from really getting it. We've got 75% of the menu or more than that was fresh produce on site using fresh ingredients, etc. We've got everything. Where we stumbled was when it then went into a national level and not what we want to do locally, and it was a national procurement. And I felt at the time that there was some contradictions with the government. There's put a lot of schemes of say what we want to connect with Soil Association or any of the other, initiatives that go along. But then when you actually come down to try and doing it, there's a contradiction that they also have some control over. So and it came as like the red tractor award and things. So we weren't getting meat that had the stamp, and that's some of that was done, was put nationally. So we could have, but then I suppose locally there's the pricing thing on it, but there was no forced commitment to say you have to go one way or the other. I mean, there's still the checks on welfare and standards for say the chicken or for the meat or whatever. We've got, we have actually got a local butcher, which is unlike any other board in Scotland. Everyone uses the same butcher. We've managed to exploit a loophole and get a local butcher to do the same with a sandwich supplier rather than the same sandwich supplier for the whole of Scotland. We've got a guy from Aberdeen. It's half a mile from the hospital. But even though we're using a local butcher, they didn't have to, by our national procurement, give us red tractor. And it's that and a couple of very similar things that stopped us from doing that. And that was, yes, I had 2 years worth of work on my part to try and get it, and then just kind of a trip at the end. But I think there is some way from above. So there's a lot of us on the ground, so to speak, trying to push from below, going, we want to do this. But once you start going up some levels, it dilutes the passion or the want to do it. There's always someone going, no, I don't really need it. So although the Scottish Government might say, yes, we'd like people to do this or like people to do that, I think they need to push a bit more and put it into regulation, into law. I mean, just with hospitals, again, we've got a document called Food in Hospitals, which is enough, you can go online and find it. And it pretty much lays out what all hospitals in Scotland should do with their menus, how you put menus together. You should have fish on the menu so many times a week. Portion sizes have to be a specific size, etc. There's many ways to do it. You'll get some boards will, buy in a lot of products we happen to decide to do here. I was ranting a few times to everybody earlier on. Every hospital right across the UK produces their food differently, produces their meals differently. It's not a chain menu. It's not just NHS food. You'll get some places will do ready meals. The other ones, like ourselves, will make fresh food in the morning and serve it that day. But this food and hospital documents can be twisted one way or another. So that was up for review as well. I would suggest that in that they could put a lot of, I shouldn't say, we must have buckwheat on the menu once a week. They could add these things in, and actually enforce it rather than saying this is a suggestion for the NHS.
Thanks very much for that, Stuart, and Christ, well done for persevering with that. I mean, it must be. I can see how challenging some of that stuff will be. But one thing I just wanted to say quickly was that at the last Scottish election, the SNP manifesto included a commitment to not just expanding Food for Life, but actually exploring the use of the model in other parts of the public sector. So what that ended up being is a pilot scheme we're doing in the Glasgow area, where we're looking to see whether it can be applied for the health board, for hospitals, but also for care homes, for prisons, for colleges, etc., etc. That work's still ongoing, but I think it's identified certainly some of the barriers that you've just outlined, and many more actually as you get through the different parts of the public sector. So a lot of work still to be done. But one positive is with the National Good Food Draft Plan that's just been published last week, there are 6 outcomes that Scottish Government wants to achieve, and increasing uptake of Food for Life is an indicator on 2 of those outcomes, which to me suggests that there needs to be an ongoing government commitment to trying to make it work, because there are quite a lot of challenges still.
Hi, sorry, yeah, Keith White from Aberdeenshire Council. I'm not in procurement, I'm in sort of economic development, but obviously I'm a rural side of things too. And I do understand that a lot of what we have to do as an authority, and I don't think we should necessarily mean that the authorities are not going to solve this problem for having local food, a market outlet basically. We need to think about further afield than just a local authority. But David, as you said, prisons, hospitals, the whole lot combined is a massive market, but we also need to think about the general populace and what they're eating. And I think really sort of saying higher up, we have to understand that whatever we're producing, people have to have confidence in what we're producing. We have to produce that confidently. And I think we are trampled a bit by too many rules and regulations of what we can and can't do and have in our diets, and what we do and what we feed ourselves and what we feed our relatives or our children. And I think if we had a bit more, just as a thought from my point of view, if we get a bit more allowance just to do our own thing almost as an authority or as a region, to do some bits and pieces and not necessarily have an overall umbrella organisation depicting what we do, because what we do certainly not up here in North East is definitely different to what they do in some areas of the Central Belt or the borders, the islands. And yet, having had a business that knows just how hard distribution is and how much of a cost it is, it's basically the biggest cost of getting your product to the customer. This is where we have to think of how we're going to do things too. We've all got some great products, but when you ask somebody the question, how can I get that buckwheat to my customer? That's where it falls down, because they can't get the product to the customer. Whether or not that's by paperwork exercise, they can't get there, they don't have a van to take it there, they don't have a distribution side of things. So it's thinking again, as Bob said, how do we do it on a cooperative basis? You know, we need to really come together as an organisation, and whether or not that could be, like you said, David, having something done on an Aberdeenshire or local authority area, or a old sort of Grampian thing, make it maybe slightly bigger. How can we do that? How can we make it work? Because that's where a lot of it all falls down. We've got some great products, we can't get them to the end consumer. So we have to have a mechanism for doing that that's cost effective. And the reason that most of the ones that we're using at the moment is because the big breaks and things of this world can get that product to that school, to that hospital, to that prison in a cost effective budget understanding way to the customer. And we can't do that on a small scale. So until we either combine to do it on a bigger scale and have a mechanism to do it with in terms of distribution, we're not really going to get very far with this unless we are told from above, you must have this in the diet, or in, I was going to say the ration, but in the diet for everybody to eat. And for that reason, you then have to be subsidised to have it done. If they want it, it comes at a cost, but that cost has to be paid for. I think we had a wee discussion about that this morning, Lorna, about some stuff. If you want something bad enough, you pay for it. So it's who's going to pay for it? We can't pay for it as a producer. So somebody has to turn around and say, right, this is what we want, therefore this is what we'll give you. And there's the coin in it, if you like, is coming back from on high, who's made a decision to get that there. It's a bit long-winded thought, but it's lots of things in there. But I think we need to be thinking more as a unit and together and doing some more stuff. So
David Miller, James Hutton Institute. Just another observation put in with respect to local, the Scottish Government's local food, at least the consultation on that strategy, threw in some interesting angles on it in terms of how you define local. But the observation I wanted to make is why local, and the angle on this might be what does local offer? So I realise this might be slightly heretical, actually, given some of our conversation, but nonetheless, in terms of provocations, what does the local angle deliver that non-local will not? If arguably a better or more competitive, better in terms of different metrics, I guess, product comes from elsewhere. And in some cases emerging through, this might not break through in Scotland more than we think, but James Hutton Institute's doing a lot of work on vertical farming, the social angles on vertical farming, the technical. But if that type of technology, which government and international bodies like European Union are investing in, if it happens to be positioned in Huntly, what's that delivering as local compared to whether it's in our offices in Invergowrie or a development site in Orkney? It's not touching the soil. It's a bit of a push to say that the water is local, therefore it's local and significant. And yet that's where a wee bit, but some of the innovations are coming. And I just wonder whether we are too bound to the word local and should reflect on why local just a little bit more. I'll stop.
I think that's a great provocation. I know we have people from my part of the world where I live in Fife here, and it would be great if they felt like it to tell us a bit about what's going on in Fife and that why local. I think, yeah, why local? What is that benefit? What is that added? What are the additional benefits we get from that? Is it important? I guess. Yeah. So I don't know. Yeah, would that be okay, Rosie?
I'll stand up. Hello, Rosie Jack, Balcaski Estate. So I kind of, and the estate, the team, we set up Bow House, which is a big sort of food hub based there, which Andrew and Scotland the Bread are based down there. So I completely get what you mean, challenging the idea of local. But for us, we've seen that it's provided a space for those makers, growers, farmers, producers to speak to the consumers directly. And I think that's important because we've seen young children to adults completely in an instant understand a product and gain confidence in a product and see the benefits of maybe spending a little bit more money, but to get something that is nutritious. You know, they can see it grown in the fields, they can understand it. And I think that's probably really important to change the way in how we look at food, buy food, and understand what we're putting into our bodies. So for us, that direct over-the-counter communication has been really, really important. Yes, that's at a much smaller scale to feeding the nation, but we have seen that work really well for us. The markets are one angle of that, and that's sort of a celebration each month. But the fact that communities can come into the space, meet the maker and see the produce, we've seen that really make sense. And actually get school kids in as well to understand the produce, and just say to them, look out your windows. What do you see being grown in the fields? When are the combines going past? Those physical things to them, I think, are making a difference to how people see food and drink, not as a quick thing that, you know, that'll fuel me, that'll keep me going. So I get what you're saying. Is the local pros enough to make it make sense? Here or there, but to me, I literally see those things making sense, and that does work for us. Does that sort of answer?
That's perfect. And I think going back to the question of rural depopulation as well, I was quite surprised. I've been doing a bit of research, trying to understand stats in Scotland for a land use roundtable we're about to host, and I was really surprised to see my part of Fife in the part that they predict depopulation. Kirkcaldy's growing, and you're part of Fife as well. And I think maybe as we started today, this is about the Just Transition Plan for Land Use and Agriculture, and a big part of that is facing the fact of we are facing quite significant rural depopulation. It's quite scary when you look at projections. So I think there's something for me in that. I know vertical farms could be placed anywhere and could offer employment anywhere as well. But I think there's something that we need to look at in terms of land and what we do with that land and who's employed by that land and what it supports. And yeah, I think it is.
Can I add on that as well? I think you're totally right. We see people, you know, everybody in my generation, I'm from a rural farming family as well, and everybody I went to school with immediately disappeared off down to London and into the cities. And that's absolutely fine. That's where the skills were needed. But if we can find ways to show businesses that actually, you know, say a farmer has a space or a bit of land they're not using or an old shed that's falling down, can they actually approach a business or open it up to businesses and say, I don't have time to, I've got my own business, I'm very, very busy, but can you move your business here? We can get fibre optic broadband. Can you relocate your family to this area to increase that? I hate the buzzword, but the sort of rural vibrancy. And we've seen that if we can get people out of the cities and back into villages and rural communities, that then those people are then employed. Maybe they job share, their families are in other rural communities as well. The children are understanding food and drink, they're growing up in a rural environment. So I think it's kind of a knock-on effect of trying to draw skills back out of cities and draw companies that can relocate for lifestyle benefits. You know, there's obviously obstacles in you know, getting their product back across the country and things like that. But the pros and cons of living rurally, I think, could be outweighed. So it's something that in our part of Fife, we're over in the East Nook is really working well, and we're trying to bring people back into those areas. So, and Kirkcaldy's lovely as well. We need to bring more people back to Kirkcaldy.
Nothing against Kirkcaldy, it's a lovely town. Yes, Kim.
Sorry, it was just to sort of add on to the why local. We've done quite a lot of reading into this recently, and I'm not an economics expert at all, but there is, I can't remember what it's called now, but there is a thing about every pound spent in this region generates more money in this region. So it's about, if we're using local suppliers, they're getting their goods from local suppliers, they're employing local people, those local people that they're paying a salary to are then going to local shops and putting money back into those local shops, rather than that whole process happening in another region because we're buying those products from that different region. So that's another big thing for why I personally would like to see more local. But also the other thing as well is carbon. That's a big thing for particularly Aberdeen City Council, but all the councils at the moment, we're trying to reduce our carbon contribution. And if we can get local suppliers, that we're not having to bring the food up from the central belt, we can get it from down the road, that does help reduce our carbon.
Someone had a hand up over here. Yep. And then I'll come.
David McCracken again, it's partly been touched on there. I was going to make the point that if I was in the Scottish Government's climate change engagement team in Edinburgh watching this remotely, I can get the social side of things, but actually where are we, what are we saying, or what are we asking them to actually push for local for, i.e. what actually sets what's important to their portfolio. And while skills are important and local nutrition is important, that's not pressing the button as far as what they need to actually try and argue for. But we're starting to get there as far as the sort of the carbon story, making sure that we are reducing some of those food miles in terms of products getting to this area, just as one example. I would continue to provoke a little bit though. Is making things supplied locally to schools or whatever good or better if all the actual inputs to those products are still coming up the whatever that is, A96, et cetera, to actually get here? So we do need to think a bit more holistically, as David was implying, in terms of making sure that we have got a proper argument for local in all the rounds.
Yep. Some of you here are just about old enough to remember Agenda 21, I reckon, from 25, 30 years ago, which was an initiative on local food, European inspired, but definitely picked up widely across this country, and it seemed to peter out. One of the skeptics who I encountered in advocating for Agenda 21 and joining our local group was saying, what's this all about? I buy local food, I go to my local Tesco. And that was meant as a serious piece of argument, because they couldn't see what it was that, local for them was purely spatial. It had nothing to do with any other values at all. And that's really the point, isn't it? That local, to answer David's provocation, no, it doesn't mean anything shorn of those other values if it's just spatial, because it actually might, in some cases, not even deliver on the reduction in carbon emissions. The moving around of small quantities locally can actually be more emitting than the bulk commodity production of large quantities going much further distances. And that's been something about certainly grain movements through history, because they were always moved on water because it was more efficient to do that before roads and railways emerged. But it seems to me that ultimately this argument resolves to a discussion of power. In whose hands is the power to make decisions? And it's clearly not in the hands of the average citizen who wants to A, understand the food system better, and B, eat better. And it seems to me that so much about the prevailing power that is mediated by commodity and globalized systems is about dancing to somebody else's tune, usually the tune of the people who have money and who speculate with our money, not on our behalf. So it seems to me that until we address that, and particularly in Scotland with the evidently missing tier of local government, which might help to at least mediate some of that power, and the voice coming up from the bottom saying, we don't like it is now, so help us, with all the wonderful sort of suggestions that have been here. But it needs at some point us to sort of tear down the Bastille and, you know, kind of say it's about time that some of this power was distributed into our hands, and thus sort of making good the democratic deficit, which is always sort of aided and abetted by things that we think of as being quite kind of neutral or inoffensive, and sometimes actually quite funny, like the advertising and marketing of junk food using cartoon characters and things like that. You know, there is some really wicked stuff going on out there in the interests of money to power, and we need to challenge that.
Yeah, Will Anderson, Seaford and Strathspey Estates. We've heard a lot about nutritional values. We've heard a lot about local employment, and it has been very much based on farm crops. But one of the things that we are perhaps needing to bring into the conversation is the wild harvest, if you like. And part of that is in terms of local employment and also nutritional value consideration of venison and venison marketing. I think that's something which I've seen a theme through here in regulation and the difficulties in overcoming regulation and marketing of produce like that, which is something I think that the Scottish Government perhaps may need to look at and address.
I think that's a really, and Kim.
It was kind of going back to what was said earlier about the regulations and improving the regulations around what's required for the hospitals and so on. We do have that with the schools. You know, there are very strict rules around what each of the product has to have and so on. Again, I say, like, I'm not part of that department, but I know that that is a definite, it makes life more difficult to have different suppliers when you have to report on absolutely everything that is in every product and have to report the food miles for every single meal, if every single meal in every single school has got different ingredients from a different place. And so that, although, you know, with the NHS and the hospitals it might work well, I think it's actually quite limiting for the councils when we're looking at 100, I think it's 140 primary schools. It makes it a lot, yeah, limiting.
I just want to come back a little bit to local. It was just a question on local. I live in Glass, which is, you know, just up the River Devon from Huntly, and there's 2 or 3 things that really matter to the community. One is the school, the other one is the village hall, and the next one after that is actually the local food that circulates around the community, whether it's pots of jam, cabbages, too many tatties, whatever's actually happening. And one of the great beauties of local food, going back to that, is that sense of community. And the question for us then is the connection into more urban areas, if you call Huntly an urban area, which is not, of course. But the point is here is that local food is community. Okay. And if we keep commoditizing it and keep moving it away to the, you know, to the big corporates, to the anyway, you lose that. You start to lose that position. I can't emphasize how important that is, okay, to anybody, and that these connections, you know, between you know, urban, as it were, and local. And I think the bit that I think we misunderstand sometimes is that Scottish Government support and policy support is because there is market failure. All right. And the reality here is that farmers can't grow the food or price the food appropriately with respect to their continuation. That's why we have government support. And of course, that comes back to a little bit of power, is where power lies. But actually, at the end of the day, they've got 600 million. It's their choice about how they use the support mechanisms. And all we're asking for, I think, is a little bit of that money to be able to help local food, which is not there at the minute. It's not so apparent.
Hi there. I mean, I'm here as a poet, but I also do have I live in Huntley, and I do have an interest in this. The project that you were talking about earlier with Anne in Huntley, the baker in Huntley, I was the other half of that. And what we were doing at the time was we were trying to cook food and get it out into the community. But the thing that I also work as the seed library. I'm one of the curators of the local seed library, so I do have an interest in growing. And but the thing that hasn't come up today, which I'm a little bit surprised at, is seasonal eating and the lack of education in the general populace for what actually is seasonal food, and obviously the increased carbon footprint from everybody who wants a cucumber at Christmas. And there does seem to be. Do you think there's an argument for an investment in education for greater understanding? And not just we're talking about children, but the general populace who don't understand what it is to eat seasonally and in local UK produce, not just Scottish produce, but stuff that actually doesn't have air miles. I mean, we've all heard the horror story of, you know, that a kiwi fruit has a larger carbon footprint than its actual physical weight. And yet I'll go into a restaurant and I'm still seeing kiwi fruit stuck on the side of the plate that people aren't even eating. So there's that across the board seasonal eating that would make just more common sense.
Oh, oh, sorry. Okay, I was just going to quickly say that there is also a push at the moment, I think, from Scottish Government level to have annual school menus, so the meals won't change all year round. So I don't know how that fits in with seasonality. So that's.
Well, that's right. Okay, that's good feedback to the Scottish Government. I thought you meant an annual as a seasonal menu. No. Right. Okay. So that's a big strong message to feedback to the Scottish Government. And no, I know. So I'm going to ask Dawn Finch back up, and she's going to, yes, did you remember? And we're going to have a final poem. I know, on Kiwis. And a final interlude, and then we'll just do the thanks and concluding text. But it's been a fantastic roundtable discussion. But I'll hand over to Dawn.
Thank you. Yeah, I could. No, it's all right. I could. Yeah, sorry about that. I have this real thing about seasonal food. And the other thing that I'd say, this is terrible because I'm just adding to my own thing here while I've got the mic, it is how few people understand storage of things, and that we're encouraged to just throw things out, the enormous amount of waste. My onions come out of the ground in September. I'm still eating them. I'll be eating, they're well stored. I will still be eating but that's waste is a whole other issue. So, but won't, you know, open that kettle of fish. This is a series from a series of poems that I wrote about, and these are what my friends call my working class poems, and that's because I kept seeing all people with nice lives talking about what they were getting up early for, like they get up early to walk the dog or go to the gym or have a run. And I thought, well, that's not what my friends are getting up early for. I have a whole different reason for getting up early. So this is called She Rises Early. And actually this poem is for Nikki Yoxall. This poem was inspired by James's wife's. She rises early to walk, stepping out alone into the deep blue of frosted dawn, and far above the sky still yawns with stars. She pauses, button fumbling, fingers rapidly numbing. Against the fabric of the day, she feels stitched by icy needles of morning. Thin light puddles across the rutted field as jagged broken mirrors reflecting pinpoint lights from distant crofts. A golden punctuation in the dark rise of a hill, cowered by winter's scarf still. Spring held at bay by the season's last gasp, the past and future within her grasp. She knows this way. Her footsteps on the ice are steady every day. A fox fixes a suspicious stare, flashing colour into the morning, chasing after nut brown hair. As the track ends and the open fields begin, unseen creatures scatter through tangled brambles within. In the pall of morning light, a blackbird sings, its heart bursting with bright need. Above, a skein pierces the horizon with 1,000 wings and voices that bleed into the rising light. She shrugs her collar a little higher, greeting cows stilled in a frozen byre. Their steaming breath plumes and rises and mingles with the mist and sighs, and she rises early to work.
That's it. Oh, I think Nikki would love that poem. Yeah. And so we're going to just conclude. I've got a few thank yous that I've got to do. It's been a full and amazing day, actually. So firstly, Roger, for giving us a tour of his farm. I think that was a wonderful start to the day to actually to see what's possible. I think it's always good. I think there's a lot of unease and feeling of powerlessness at the moment with farmers, and we see it across the UK. And I think the answer does lie in farmer to farmer and supporting each other and seeing what's possible, and farmers showing us the way. So thank you, Roger. That was an amazing tour. To the artists, Dawn Finch and Sarah McFadden, your songs and your poems were wonderful. Really enjoyed those interludes. To all the panelists who did their provocations today, I think that really spurred the debate and helped us move. And to the back of the house team, so Magda and Brodie and David and Eleanor. So thank you for all your work. Big applause to them. And a huge thank you to the Scottish Government for supporting this. I hope that they will take on board quite all the feedback that we will write up and send to them. It's really changing times at the moment, but there's a huge opportunity. There's lots of decisions getting made at the moment. So I think we do have an opportunity to really shape what goes forward in Scotland. To JHI, SRUC, Rao Institute and Safari Gateway for sponsoring this event too. So thank you all. And finally, to everyone who's attended, it's been fantastic and a wonderful room and great discussions. And I suppose to the people of Huntly and Aberdeenshire, there's lots of cheerleaders in the room for you here. We really like to see things working here, and I think there's a good feeling of things moving forward. But yeah, do reach out and speak to all these people that have come together and use their expertise and their help and their support. So thank you very much.